My beloved child, something changed the instant your photograph touched that table, and the person holding it was not prepared for what came next. They had walked into that quiet room expecting confirmation. Nothing more. A simple answer. A convenient explanation. Perhaps even a reason to keep believing the version of you they had created inside their own mind. The third party had studied your photograph more times than they would ever admit. They had searched your expression for weakness, uncertainty, some tiny detail that would make you easier to understand. But that evening, beneath a low lamp and the strange stillness of a room filled with old books, glass objects, and handwritten notes, they finally placed your picture in front of someone who knew absolutely nothing about you. And then the psychic stopped moving. Not dramatically. Not for effect. She simply looked at your photograph, and became unusually quiet. That silence was the first thing the third party had not planned for. Because they had arrived with questions about love. Who cared more? Who would stay? Who would eventually walk away? They thought your photograph would give them an advantage. Instead, it began removing one. The psychic slowly turned the picture toward the light. She looked at your eyes. Then at the third party. And asked one unexpected question. Why are you so determined to misunderstand this person? The room changed. Stay with this moment, because what happened next explains why something inside that third party suddenly began disappearing. They tried to laugh. They said they were only curious. They insisted the photograph meant nothing. But their fingers were gripping the edge of the chair. Because deep inside, they already knew this visit was never really about curiosity. It was about certainty. They wanted someone else to tell them that you were ordinary. Predictable. Easy to replace. They wanted to hear that whatever connection surrounded you could eventually be copied by someone else. But the psychic did not say that. Instead, she placed two fingers beside your photograph and whispered something so simple that the third party immediately looked away. This person does not enter lives to compete. A pause followed. They enter lives to reveal. And that sentence unsettled everything. Because suddenly the story was no longer about who could win someone's attention. It was about what your presence had already uncovered. What if the reason certain people react so strongly to you has nothing to do with you chasing them? And everything to do with what they begin seeing in themselves when you stop chasing? That was the first revelation. But it was not the one that changed the third party's feelings. Not yet. The psychic kept studying the photograph. Then she noticed something else. She asked whether you had recently become quieter. Whether you had stopped explaining yourself as much. Whether you were beginning to protect your energy instead of proving your intentions. The third party froze. Because those details were accurate. Too accurate. You had changed. Not loudly. There had been no announcement. No dramatic declaration. You had simply begun stepping away from situations that demanded too much of your peace. And that quiet evolution had already been noticed. The third party had mistaken it for distance. The psychic called it something entirely different. Preparation. One word. Yet it landed heavily. Preparation for what? That question remained suspended in the room. And strangely, the third party no longer seemed interested in asking about romance. Now they wanted to know what you were becoming. The psychic leaned closer to the photograph. Her expression softened. Then she said, "The person you are worried about is approaching a point where old versions of them will no longer fit." The third party swallowed. Because suddenly they understood why their old strategy around you had stopped working. Comparison did not move you anymore. Silence did not confuse you the way it once had. Other people's opinions were beginning to lose their power over your decisions. You were becoming harder to manipulate, not because you had become cold, but because you had become clear. And clarity changes relationships. It reveals which connections were built on truth, and which ones only survived while someone remained uncertain. Here is where everything turned. The third party looked again at your photograph. But something in their expression was different now. That strange attachment they had carried toward you, the fascination, the need to measure themselves against you, the emotional obsession with knowing what you were doing, began collapsing. Because the psychic was about to reveal what you truly represented in this story. And once she said it aloud, the third party would never be able to look at your photograph the same way again. She lifted the picture, took one slow breath, and began with 4 words. "This person is actually." Then she stopped. Because what followed was bigger than anything the third party had come there prepared to hear. The next sentence did not sound mystical at all. It sounded almost painfully human. The psychic lowered your photograph and said, "This person is actually a mirror for truth." The third party stared at her. A mirror? That was not the answer they expected. They had imagined something dramatic. Something they could use. A label. A prediction. Maybe even a warning that would finally make your presence easier to dismiss. Instead, they received something far more uncomfortable. Because a mirror does not chase anyone. It does not argue. It does not convince. It simply reveals what is already standing in front of it. And suddenly, the third party began understanding why being aware of you had affected them so deeply. Your existence had been forcing them to notice things they preferred not to examine. Their insecurity. Their comparisons. Their need to control how others saw them. Even the strange attachment they had developed toward knowing what you were doing. The psychic slid the photograph back across the table. "Look carefully," she said. The third party hesitated. For the first time that evening, they did not want to look at your face. That detail matters. Because moments earlier, they had arrived believing the problem was you. Now they were beginning to wonder whether the real conflict had always been happening inside themselves. And that realization changed the emotional temperature of the room. Their fixation on you began weakening. Not because they suddenly disliked you. Something far stranger happened. The version of love they thought they carried toward you, the fascination, the emotional competition, the constant need to keep you psychologically close, started dissolving when they realized it was never peaceful love at all. It was attachment mixed with comparison. And once that distinction became visible, they could no longer pretend otherwise. What if some feelings disappear only because truth finally gives them their correct name? Hold on to that question. Because the psychic had not finished. She asked the third party why they had brought your photograph instead of their own. Silence. They had no answer. Then she asked another question. If you removed this person completely from your thoughts for 30 days, what would you finally have to face about yourself? That question landed differently. The third party looked toward the window. And for several seconds, nobody spoke. This was the moment their feelings toward you truly changed. Not into hatred. Not into resentment. Into release. For the first time, they understood that watching you had become a distraction from building their own future. Your path was not supposed to become their prison. And their path was never supposed to depend on defeating yours. If this message is connecting with something you have quietly experienced, you can share it with someone who may need the same perspective. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if you want to continue this unfolding story with me. Because now the reading moved in an entirely unexpected direction. The psychic turned your photograph face down. Then she reached for a blank sheet of paper. On it, she drew a single horizontal line. At one end, she wrote one word. Past. At the other. Becoming. Then she placed a small mark almost at the far edge. That, she said softly, is where this person is standing. The third party leaned forward. The psychic continued. They are much closer to becoming someone new than the people around them realize. And suddenly the strange details made sense. Your distance. Your changing priorities. Your refusal to react to things that once consumed your attention. You were not disappearing. You were reorganizing your life. Quietly. Deliberately. Almost invisibly. But then came the detail that made the third party sit upright. The psychic said there was one person connected to your future who had already noticed this transformation. Someone who had been watching your silence very differently. Not as rejection. Not as weakness. As evidence. Evidence that you were becoming ready for something neither you nor the third party had fully understood yet. The third party immediately knew who she meant. And when they whispered that person's identity, the psychic finally turned your photograph face up again. This time she pointed directly at it. There is something this person does not know yet, she said. And when they discover it, the entire relationship around this photograph changes. The third party's expression tightened. Because the secret was no longer about what you were. It was about what someone had already decided to do because of who you were becoming. And that decision was much closer than anyone realized. Nobody in that room expected the next discovery to come from something the psychic had never been told. She moved your photograph slightly to the side. Then, without looking at the third party, she asked, has someone recently started making quiet changes because of this person? The question seemed harmless. But the third party's face changed immediately. Because yes. There had been changes. Small ones. Almost invisible from the outside. Your soulmate had begun behaving differently. Certain conversations were ending sooner. Certain people no longer received the same access. Plans that once seemed permanent were suddenly being reconsidered. Even their phone habits had changed. Messages were being typed, erased, rewritten. Old photographs had been revisited. And more than once, your soulmate had gone completely silent after hearing your name. The third party had noticed all of it. They simply had not understood why. Until now. The psychic looked toward your photograph again and said, someone has reached the point where pretending not to care requires more energy than admitting what they feel. That sentence struck deeper than anything before it. Because the third party suddenly remembered a conversation from only days earlier. Your soulmate had been asked a simple question about the future. Where did they see themselves? What did they really want? They avoided answering at first. Then, after a long pause, they said something the third party could not forget. I don't want to keep building a life that looks right but feels wrong. There it was. The missing piece. The third party had assumed your soulmate was simply confused. But confusion was no longer the problem. They were becoming clear. And clarity has a strange way of making false arrangements uncomfortable. Stay close to this part, because the photograph had now revealed something nobody came there expecting to discuss. The psychic said your soulmate's biggest decision was not about choosing between two people. It was about choosing between two versions of themselves. One version wanted familiarity, predictability, the safety of keeping everything exactly where it had always been. The other version wanted honesty, growth, a future that actually felt alive. And somehow, your presence had become connected to that second version. Not because you were forcing anything. Quite the opposite. You had stopped forcing. You had stopped trying to be understood by everyone. You had begun walking toward your own future. And from a distance, your soulmate could feel it. That was what changed everything. The third party finally asked the question they had been avoiding. So what happens now? The psychic did not answer immediately. She reached for your photograph one final time and placed it directly in front of them. Then she said, "Now you stop asking what this person is going to lose." A quiet pause. And start asking what they are about to gain. Those words landed differently. Because until that moment, the third party had viewed your story through competition. Someone wins. Someone loses. Someone gets chosen. Someone gets left behind. But perhaps that was never the real story. Perhaps this was about alignment. Three people being pushed toward truths they could no longer avoid. The third party toward self-awareness. Your soulmate toward honesty. And you toward something even larger. What if the distance you once questioned was actually creating room for the future to rearrange itself? What if the silence was not empty? What if it was preparation? The psychic suddenly turned your photograph over. On the back was something the third party had completely forgotten. A tiny handwritten date. They stared at it. Their breathing changed. Because that date was connected to a moment between you and your soulmate that almost nobody knew about. A promise had been made around that time. Not publicly. Not dramatically. But privately. And apparently, your soulmate had never forgotten it. The psychic pointed toward the date. This is why they are changing things now. The third party looked confused. Then came the question that opened an entirely new mystery. What promise? For the first time that night, the psychic smiled. Because the answer was not hidden in the photograph. It was hidden somewhere your soulmate had kept untouched for a very long time. And only one person knew where to find it. What they found next was not inside a phone, a message thread, or some dramatic confession. It was inside an old envelope. One your soulmate had kept hidden between the pages of a book they had not opened in years. The third party did not know that yet. But the psychic seemed certain that whatever had been preserved from that date mattered more than everything they had discussed so far. She looked at the handwritten number on the back of your photograph again. Then she asked quietly, "Who keeps old things when they claim they have moved on?" That question changed the room. Because the third party knew the answer. Your soulmate did. Not everything. Only certain things. A receipt from a particular day. A folded note. A photograph no one else had seen. A book that had somehow survived every cleanup, every move, every attempt to leave the past where it belonged. And suddenly, the third party remembered something strange. Weeks earlier, your soulmate had taken that same book from a shelf. They opened it. Looked inside. Then closed it almost immediately when someone entered the room. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Now it felt different. The psychic did not call it fate. She called it unfinished truth. There is a difference. Fate suggests you simply wait. Truth asks you to become ready. And your soulmate had been becoming ready without telling anyone. The third party's fascination with you had already begun fading because they could finally see the situation clearly. But now another emotion replaced it. Understanding. For the first time, they realized your soulmate was not being pulled toward you because of pressure, fantasy, or competition. They were being pulled toward a version of themselves they had once promised not to abandon. And somehow, you were connected to that promise. The envelope was found later that evening. Your soulmate had returned home after an ordinary day. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden phone call. No unexpected visitor. They simply walked past that shelf. Stopped. Then walked backward. Something had reminded them of the date. Maybe a sentence. Maybe a memory. Maybe the strange way certain moments return only when you are finally capable of understanding them. They opened the book. The envelope slipped onto the floor. For several seconds, your soulmate only stared at it. Their name was written on the front. But the handwriting was their own. That was the surprise. They had written this years ago. To themselves. The paper inside contained only a few lines. And one sentence had been underlined twice. If I ever start choosing comfort over truth, remember the person who made me feel brave enough to imagine a different life. Your soulmate read it again. Then again. And there was your answer. You were never the promise. You were the reminder. A reminder of courage. Of honesty. Of the person they wanted to become before fear, routine, and other people's expectations became louder than their own inner voice. That is why the third party's attachment collapsed after the psychic reading. They finally understood there was nothing to compete with. This was never about replacing anyone. It was about awakening something. And that realization freed them too. If this story has stayed with you this far, share it with someone who may need this perspective, leave a thought in the comments, and subscribe if you want to follow what unfolds next. Because the envelope contained one more thing. A second piece of paper. Much newer. Your soulmate had added it recently. Only 3 words were written across the top. I chose differently. Below those words was a decision. A real one. Something they had already changed quietly without telling you. And when you discover what that decision was, you may finally understand why everything around this connection has started moving again. The most important choice had already been made days before anyone noticed the consequences. Your soulmate sat alone with that newer page in their hands, reading the 3 words again. I chose differently. Simple words. But behind them was a decision that had taken months to reach. They had stopped making plans around what would keep everyone else comfortable. Stopped saying yes simply because saying no would require an explanation. Stopped pretending that a future built from obligation could somehow become fulfilling if they waited long enough. And then they made one concrete change. They canceled something. Something significant. A plan that had once represented the direction their life was supposed to take. The third party had heard about that cancellation but misunderstood it completely. They assumed your soulmate was uncertain. Maybe overwhelmed. Maybe going through another temporary phase. But the truth was much quieter. Your soulmate was clearing space. Not specifically for a person. For honesty. That distinction matters. Because they were no longer asking, how do I get back what I lost? They were asking, what kind of life would I choose if I stopped being afraid of disappointing people? And your memory kept appearing beside that question. Not as pressure. As evidence. Evidence that there had once been a version of them willing to imagine more. The psychic had sensed the transformation through your photograph, but now the reason was becoming visible. Your soulmate had begun dismantling an old future before they even knew what the new one would look like. That requires courage. To leave a familiar road without demanding that the next road reveal every turn first. And this is where the third party finally understood why their emotional fixation on you had disappeared. They had spent so much time believing you possessed something they needed to defeat. But you were not holding a prize. You were standing at the edge of your own becoming. And so was your soulmate. Two separate journeys. Two people learning to choose truth. Perhaps that was why the connection had remained emotionally significant even through distance. Because some people do not remind us merely of affection. They remind us of who we were when we still believed our lives could change. But there was another detail. One the psychic never saw. After canceling that old plan, your soulmate opened their phone. They searched your name. Your conversation appeared. Months of silence sat between the last message and the blinking cursor. They typed. I think I finally understand what happened. Then deleted it. They tried again. There is something I should have told you a long time ago. Deleted. Once more. This time they wrote only. Are you awake? Their thumb hovered above send. For nearly a minute. Then the screen went dark. No message was sent. Not because they changed their mind. Because they realized they did not want their first honest conversation with you to begin from panic. They wanted to come prepared. Clear. Responsible for their own choices. That was new. And maybe that is the part nobody expected. The greatest evidence of change was not that they suddenly wanted to reach you. It was that they were finally learning how to approach you differently. Without games. Without mixed signals. Without placing the burden of their confusion in your hands. Then something happened the following morning. Your soulmate received a message from the third party. Only one sentence. No accusation. No competition. No hidden meaning. It said, I think you need to tell them the truth now. Your soulmate stared at those words. Because the one person they expected to resist this connection had just opened the door. But what the third party revealed in their next message was even more unexpected. They told your soulmate about the psychic. About the photograph. About the reading. And about one final statement the psychic had made after everyone thought the session was over. A statement the third party had deliberately kept secret until now. Your soulmate read it once. Then stood completely still. Because those final words were not about your past. They were about what would happen when you finally learned why that photograph had been taken in the first place. The photograph had never been taken to discover who you were. It had been taken to prove something about your soulmate. That was the truth nobody saw coming. When the third party finally explained everything, your soulmate read the message twice, then sat down without saying a word. Apparently, before visiting the psychic, the third party had already made up their mind. They believed your soulmate's feelings toward you were nothing more than unfinished attachment. A memory. A habit. Something that could be exposed, explained, and eventually erased. So they chose one photograph of you. Not the newest one. Not the clearest one. A particular photograph where you were not posing, not performing, not trying to impress anyone. You were simply looking away from the camera. Calm. Almost distant. The third party had selected it because they believed it showed nothing special. And that was precisely why the psychic's reaction disturbed them so deeply. Because she did not talk about your appearance. She did not describe some fantasy. She looked at that ordinary photograph and asked, who changed after meeting this person? Not who fell in love. Not who became obsessed. Who changed? That question destroyed the entire reason the third party had come there. They wanted proof that your soulmate could forget you. Instead, the reading began revealing why forgetting you had never solved anything. Your soulmate had not been struggling because you possessed some mysterious power over them. They had been struggling because your presence had once made them confront themselves honestly. Their fears. Their compromises. Their abandoned dreams. The parts of their life they kept postponing. That was what kept returning. Not merely your face. Not merely memories. A question. Am I living like the person I said I wanted to become? And every time your soulmate avoided that question, thoughts of you returned. Can you see how different this is? Sometimes a person is not unforgettable because they constantly demand our attention. Sometimes they become unforgettable because they are connected to the moment we first saw ourselves clearly. The third party finally understood that. And once they did, whatever they had been calling love for you vanished. Because it had never been love in the peaceful sense. It was curiosity mixed with comparison. They had been watching you because they wanted to decode why your soulmate could not emotionally reduce you to the past. Now they knew. You represented a turning point. The psychic had apparently said one final thing after returning your photograph. If they keep treating this person like a destination, they will repeat the same mistake. The third party asked what she meant. Her answer changed everything. This person is not the destination. They are connected to the direction. Think about that. Your soulmate's future was not supposed to become a mission to possess you. Their real task was to become honest enough to meet you without old confusion. To build themselves. To choose clearly. To stop hiding behind convenient relationships, comfortable plans, and half-spoken truths. Only then could anything genuine happen between you. When your soulmate read this part of the message, they slowly placed their phone down. And instead of immediately contacting you, they did something nobody expected. They opened a drawer. removed a folder, and began pulling out documents connected to the plan they had cancelled. There were applications, dates, reservations, notes, evidence of a future they had once accepted because everyone around them thought it made sense. At the bottom was a page with 2 columns. One said, "Life expected of me." The other, "Life I actually want." Your soulmate had written that page months ago. But the second column was almost empty. Almost. Because one sentence had been added recently. "I want relationships where I don't have to hide what matters to me." They stared at it for a long time. Then added another sentence. "I want to become someone who can tell the truth before it becomes regret." And that was when your name appeared on their phone again. Not because you messaged. Because your soulmate opened your contact deliberately. This time, they did not type. They pressed something else. Your number began appearing on the screen. But just before the call could connect, your soulmate noticed one detail attached to your old conversation. A saved voice message. One they had somehow never opened. And according to the date beneath it, you had sent it on the exact same day they wrote that original promise to themselves. The timestamp on that unopened voice message made your soulmate forget everything else in the room. Same date. Same promise. Same night they had written those words about becoming brave enough to choose a different life. For several seconds, they did nothing. Their thumb rested above the message while a strange thought moved through them. What if the answer had been sitting here all along? Not hidden by anyone. Not stolen. Not erased. Simply unheard. They pressed play. At first, there was only background noise. A passing car. A door closing somewhere. Your breathing. Then your voice. Quiet. Careful. Different from the way they remembered it. You were not asking them to return. You were not demanding an explanation. You were not trying to convince them of anything. You said something far more difficult to forget. "I don't know if you'll ever listen to this, but I hope one day you choose the life that actually feels like yours." Your soulmate stopped the recording. Their eyes closed. Because those words were almost identical to what they had written privately that same night. And you could not have known. That was the detail that shook them. 2 people. 2 different places. The same evening. Both thinking about the same question. What does it mean to live honestly? They played the recording again. This time, they let it continue. You spoke about how sometimes people confuse love with holding on. How sometimes caring for someone means refusing to keep them trapped inside a version of themselves they have already outgrown. Then came a sentence your soulmate had never heard before. "I don't need you to choose me. I need you to stop abandoning yourself." Silence followed. Long enough that your soulmate thought the recording had ended. But then your voice returned. "And if we ever meet again, I hope we meet as 2 people who finally know who they are." The message ended. No dramatic goodbye. No promise. Just truth. Your soulmate sat completely still. Now the psychic's words made sense in an entirely different way. You were connected to the direction. Not the destination. You had never been standing at the end of their path asking them to run toward you. You had been one of the moments that made them realize they had a path at all. And suddenly, the third party's visit to the psychic seemed almost strangely necessary. They had gone there hoping to weaken your significance. Instead, they uncovered the real reason your memory remained powerful. It was never about obsession. It was about recognition. Your soulmate recognized the person they wanted to become whenever they remembered what you had once asked them to protect within themselves. Their courage. Their honesty. Their ability to choose. But then something unexpected happened. Your soulmate checked the details of that voice message. It had not merely been unopened. It had been moved into an archived conversation almost immediately after arriving. And your soulmate did not remember doing that. They searched their memory. That night had been chaotic. People around them had been giving advice. Someone had taken their phone for a few minutes while they were distracted. A small moment. Easy to forget. Until now. Their breathing slowed. Because only one other person had been nearby that evening. The same person who had later become deeply involved in keeping distance between you. Your soulmate did not jump to conclusions. They wanted facts. So they opened an old backup. Scrolled through forgotten screenshots. Dates. Messages. Fragments of conversations. And there it was. A screenshot from that night showing your voice message already delivered. Beneath it was another message from someone else. Only 6 words. Don't listen. It will confuse you. Your soulmate stared at the screen. The identity attached to those words changed the entire story. Because it was not the third party who had sent them. It was someone much closer. Someone your soulmate had trusted completely. And now, for the first time, they realized the photograph, the psychic, the cancelled future, and years of misunderstanding might all lead back to one decision made by that person on the very night everything changed. The name on that old screenshot belonged to someone your soulmate never thought they would have to question. Not an enemy. Not the third party. Someone trusted. Someone whose advice had once sounded protective. And that made the discovery harder to process. Your soulmate stared at those 6 words again. Don't listen. It will confuse you. For years, that sentence had seemed harmless. Maybe even caring. But now, after finally hearing your voice message, it carried an entirely different meaning. Because your message had not been confusing at all. It had been clear. You had not asked for promises. You had not asked your soulmate to abandon their life. You had simply encouraged them to stop abandoning themselves. So why had someone wanted that message buried? Your soulmate began scrolling further back. One conversation. Then another. Old fragments that once seemed unrelated started connecting. There were moments when your name had appeared, followed immediately by warnings. Don't reopen that chapter. You're better off not knowing. Just leave things where they are. At the time, your soulmate believed those words were helping them move forward. But what if moving forward had never been the real goal? What if someone was simply afraid of what your soulmate might decide once they began thinking independently? That possibility changed everything. Your soulmate did not become angry. They became observant. And observation can reveal what emotion often misses. They noticed that every time they had considered contacting you, this trusted person had suddenly introduced doubt. Every time your soulmate spoke positively about you, an old mistake was brought up. Every time they wondered whether the story between you had been misunderstood, someone quickly redirected the conversation. Not dramatically. Subtly. One sentence at a time. That was why nobody noticed. But now the pattern was visible. And once a pattern becomes visible, it becomes very difficult to return to ignorance. Here is where the story took another turn. Your soulmate searched for one particular conversation from years ago. They remembered telling this trusted person about the promise hidden inside that book. The promise to choose truth over comfort. At the time, the person had smiled and said, "You'll understand someday." Those words had always sounded supportive. Now your soulmate wondered what they really meant. They kept searching. Finally, they found a message sent only hours after your voice recording arrived. It said, "If they hear that message tonight, everything we planned could change." Everything we planned. Your soulmate read that line slowly. Who was we? And what exactly had been planned? That question opened a door nobody had expected. Because suddenly this was no longer simply about one archived voice message. There had been conversations happening around your soulmate without their full awareness. People had opinions about who they should become. Where they should live. What future they should choose. Which relationships were appropriate. Which dreams were practical. And somewhere inside all of those expectations, your presence had represented unpredictability. You made your soulmate ask questions. Questions other people could not answer for them. That was what frightened them. Not you. Possibility. The possibility that your soulmate might choose differently. Remember the psychic's line? This person is connected to the direction. Now it made even more sense. You represented a direction nobody else could control. And your soulmate was finally beginning to understand why your photograph had created such an unexpected reaction. The third party had taken it to the psychic expecting certainty. Instead, everyone involved was slowly being forced to examine their own motives. The third party had already released their fixation. Your soulmate had begun reclaiming their choices. And now one trusted person's influence was being exposed, not through accusation, but through old evidence. But your soulmate still needed one answer. Why? Why had this person cared so much about keeping you apart? They found that answer in an old email. The subject line was ordinary. Almost boring. Regarding the future. Your soulmate opened it. The message had been sent between two people close to them. At first, it discussed practical matters. Plans. Responsibilities. Expectations. Then your name appeared. And beneath it was one sentence that made your soulmate lean closer to the screen. If they choose that person, they may finally realize they never wanted the future we prepared for them. There it was. Not hatred. Not jealousy. Fear of losing influence. Your soulmate closed their eyes. For years, they thought people had been protecting them from you. Now they could see that some of those people had actually been protecting a version of the future they wanted your soulmate to accept. And that realization brought something unexpected. Peace. Because your soulmate finally understood that the past did not need to be rewritten. It needed to be understood. They could not recover every lost moment. But they could choose differently now. So they reached for their phone again. Your contact was still open. This time, they did not type a message. They did not hesitate over a call. Instead, they recorded a voice note. Their first words were simple. "I finally heard what you sent me." Then they paused. Because what they were about to say next was not merely an apology. It was the truth they had spent years learning how to speak. And before pressing send, your soulmate added one final sentence that could change the entire direction of what happens between you next. The final sentence was the one your soulmate had been afraid to say for years. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was honest. They held the phone close and said, "I don't want to return to the past. I want to meet you again as the person I should have been honest enough to become." Then silence. Their thumb hovered over the screen. Everything that had happened seemed to gather inside that tiny moment. The archived message. The old promise. The psychic's unexpected reading. The third party finally releasing their need to compete with you. The hidden conversations. The future other people had tried to design. And now this. One voice note waiting to be sent. Your soulmate looked at your photograph again. The same photograph that had started the entire chain of revelations. But this time, they noticed something they had overlooked. You were not looking toward the camera. You were looking somewhere beyond it. Toward something nobody else in the image could see. For some reason, that detail made them smile. Because perhaps that had always been the difference between you and everyone who tried to define you. You kept looking forward. Even when people misunderstood you. Even when explanations failed. Even when distance made everything uncertain. You continued becoming. And now your soulmate understood why the psychic had refused to describe you as someone meant to be possessed, won, or defeated. You represented movement. Growth. A future that could not be entered while carrying the same old patterns. So your soulmate pressed send. The message left their phone. No dramatic music. No instant miracle. Just a small checkmark appearing beneath the recording. Yet something inside them changed immediately. They had finally acted without asking anyone else whether they were allowed. That mattered more than your response. Because this time, their honesty was not dependent on a guaranteed outcome. They were telling the truth because it deserved to be told. Minutes passed. Then 20. Then nearly an hour. Your soulmate placed the phone face down and walked toward the window. Strangely, they felt calm. Years ago, silence from you would have terrified them. They would have invented explanations. Assumed rejection. Asked someone else what your silence meant. Not anymore. They had learned something powerful. Another person's response cannot be used as proof of your worth. Truth is still truth even when it is waiting to be answered. Then the phone vibrated. Your soulmate turned. One notification. Your name. Their heartbeat changed. But the message was not what they expected. You had not written, "I missed you." You had not asked where they had been. You had not demanded an explanation. You sent a photograph. At first, your soulmate did not understand it. It showed an ordinary table. A cup. A notebook. Morning light falling across one corner. Then they noticed the notebook page. 3 handwritten words were visible. Still choosing forward. Your soulmate stared at them, because the phrase felt strangely familiar. Then another message arrived. I heard your note. Nothing else. A few seconds later. And I'm glad you finally heard mine. Your soulmate sat down. There was no accusation in your words. No attempt to make them suffer for lost time. Only recognition. But then you sent one final line. And this was where the entire story shifted again. I think there's something you still don't know about that photograph. Your soulmate immediately looked toward the picture. What could possibly remain? The psychic had seen it. The third party had explained why they chose it. The date on the back had revealed the old promise. Every secret seemed connected to that single image. Until you wrote. That photograph wasn't originally yours. Your soulmate froze. Another message appeared. I gave it to someone years ago. Someone. Not them. Not the third party. Someone else. And suddenly, a new question entered the story. How had a photograph you gave to one person years ago ended up in the third party's hands now? Your soulmate asked exactly that. This time, your reply took longer. When it finally arrived, it contained only a name. The same name from the screenshot. The trusted person who had told your soulmate never to listen to your voice message. And now it appeared they had possessed your photograph long before anyone realized. Which meant their involvement in this story had begun much earlier than the archived message. Much earlier than the third party. Perhaps even before you and your soulmate were separated at all. A detail from years ago had just become more important than every recent revelation combined. Your soulmate stared at the name on the screen. The same trusted person. The same person who had discouraged them from hearing your voice. The same person who had quietly shaped so many decisions. And now, somehow, your photograph had once been in their possession too.